Fair warning, this video discusses suicide and death. Unfortunately, YouTube doesn't make it very easy for you to pull up specific comments, but in one of my recent videos, someone suggested something to the point of talking about how they handle the deaths in Degrassi. And as someone who enjoyed most of the depictions of death and the fallout of it in Degrassi, I gotta admit I was really taken with the idea. There haven't been a ton of deaths, but there have been enough to where there are different iterations of essentially talking about the same topic, trying to deal with the fact that someone suddenly isn't there anymore. And I especially think it might be worth delving into all the deaths in Degrassi and dissecting them one by one. Of course, some had more lasting effects than others, but all are very powerful in one way or another, especially in the episodes that follow directly. And what better place to start than the very first death in Degrassi? Quick note from future NotAVampyre, I completely forgot about Wheels' parents before I started recording, and I'd already done all the prep work for this episode, and in order to do an episode about Wheels' parents, I need to go back and rewatch some stuff, so I'm going to steam on ahead with this one and come back to Wheels' parents. Please bear with my sometimes scattered brain. All through Degrassi Junior High, the Degrassi production team didn't think they'd ever be able to tackle suicide, which kinda makes sense. Degrassi Junior High was aimed towards a younger audience that might not have been suited for an actual suicide story, and leaving it at suicide ideation like what Stephanie had might have been all that they really could have done. But then they moved on to Degrassi High, and they finally felt that now was a good time to try to tackle the subject, especially because they're already dealing with mature topics like having AIDS and understanding that you're going to die probably sooner than your friends. Claude Tanner really wasn't a big character in Degrassi High. He was introduced in the first season as a love interest for Caitlin and kind of a muse, inspiring her mind in a way that Joey just didn't. They seemed like a really good pair, especially at the beginning because, for one, they both cared about the environment, activism, and more highbrow topics like foreign films. But then it started to become clear that they might not really be good for each other. For one, Claude would kind of pressure Caitlin into doing things that he wanted to do, i.e. vandalizing a factory wall. And then when they inevitably got caught, Claude took off and left Caitlin there dangling on the fence when he could have helped her and they could have gotten away together. Though Caitlin is rightfully angry, it does make sense why Claude ran. He felt that Caitlin could get away with things that he just couldn't with his parents. Caitlin's mom was an activist in her own day, having even gotten arrested at one point. So he thought that they'd go easier on Caitlin if she was caught, but then his parents? We don't get to ever meet his parents, but just hearing how he talks about them and how other people around him describe his parents, it's clearly not a happy home life for him. And something like getting charged for vandalism, that would just upset any volatile balance that his home life has. But that still doesn't make up for the fact that he abandoned Caitlin, and then he abandoned her again when she was looking for some sort of support at her trial. At first, Claude says yes, he'll go there support her, but then he asks his parents to miss school to go to her trial, which, as Caitlin rightfully points out, he only did that to get out of it. He knew his parents would say no, that he couldn't miss school for something like that. Sure, he was afraid that the officer there would recognize him as Caitlin's cohort, but that was still a very jerk move, to promise that he'd go support Caitlin, only to create a situation where he wouldn't be able to do so, all the while saying that he still loves her and wants them to work out. And this is where Caitlin is with her relationship with Claude as season 2 rolls around. Up until the two-parter Showtime, we really don't see Claude around, except for just mentioning here and there that they're not together anymore. At that point, they hadn't been together for about a year, but as Claude makes it clear, he still wants to get back with Caitlin. But Caitlin really doesn't want anything to do with him, and for fairly good reason. She sees him being around her as pestering, asking if they could get back together, and then finally before he kills himself, trying to give her a rose, trying to say goodbye. We kind of get the sense that he at least did something like this as soon as they broke up, or possibly had been doing it interspersed between then and now. It's really hard to say, but regardless, Caitlin just doesn't want anything to do with him now. And then he kills himself. And Caitlin's not really sure what to feel. For the most part, she just kind of wants to move on, not have to think about all the uncomfortableness that comes with having known someone to kill themselves and also having had interacted with them just beforehand. Her situation is especially made more awkward because, as I said, just before he died, he told Caitlin goodbye and gave her a parting rose. Now, of course, Caitlin didn't know what he meant by that. As she explains herself, she thought that he was visiting relatives or something. And then to make it even worse, after his death, she received a box of flowers and a note from him, basically saying, by now you should know what I've done, just know that I love you and I'm always thinking about you. Now, on the one hand, you could interpret this as wanting your loved ones to know how you felt about them now that you won't be able to say it anymore. But as Joey points out, you can also interpret it as him wanting Caitlin to feel guilty about what happened. Now, before I go any further, I feel the need to say that people don't kill themselves to hurt others or because they want others to feel pain. That doesn't happen in real life. But in this situation with Claude, he didn't kill himself just because he wanted other people to hurt. But that's something that he clearly wanted with his suicide. I think Joey's right. He wanted Caitlin to post-mortem feel sorry for him, to recognize how much he loved her and how much it hurt that she didn't want anything to do with him. And not just that, but to feel guilty for how she treated him. And part of that can be backed up by just how much anger he had towards everyone. Recall how he reacted when Bronco and Lucy didn't think that his monologue was good for a talent show that's supposed to be lighthearted and fun. He got furious, called people names, and then when his friend Joanne tried to talk to him, try to help him out in some way, he rejected her, basically accusing her of only trying to help because she's just being nice, as though she doesn't actually care about him, and also being angered by the thought that no one else knows what it is to be him. And of course, as Joanne points out later on after his death, that she's been where Claude was, it's still very easy when you're in that mindset to think that you're an island. No one else has ever been where you are or will ever know what it is to be you. Sure, their situations weren't exactly the same from what we can tell, but she more than anyone else in the cast probably had insight into what he was feeling. And I think it's important to also note that Claude rejected any sort of help. Not only did he reject Joanne, but he also rejected a teacher who Joanne told about Claude's situation. He wouldn't let anyone help him. Another one of the things that I find so interesting about the situation and how Degrassi handled it is that they gave a moment to recognize how the rest of the cast was feeling about this. Just take a moment to explore what mindset they'd be in and how they'd react to something like this happening in their school. I really love the classroom discussions that they have, people chiming in with different opinions, trying to process the news that they're hearing. And I'm glad that Degrassi pointed out that there's really no right way to deal with a suicide. You may feel concerned for their immortal soul if your religion condemns suicide. You may feel that the person was being selfish by killing themselves in an area where a lot of people go and someone's bound to find them. Or you may be confused. Why would someone try to kill themselves? What amount of problems could possibly put someone in that state? Suicide can be very confusing for some people. Life is viewed as beautiful and something to be cherished. And yet then trying to imagine a situation where someone could value their life so little and in fact resent it enough to end it. Not everyone can empathize with feeling the way Claude did. And while it may come off as being insensitive or wrong to feel that way, it was important for Degrassi to show it because again, it's realistic. Not everyone can understand something like this. I especially love the classroom talks because it reminds me when they did essentially the same thing in season 2 when they were dealing with racism and trying to be proud of where you come from while also having to deal with the stigmatization of that. It's something that I kind of wish they did more because they were able to rapid fire show many different viewpoints and really give you a taste for the spectrum of reactions there are. Speaking of someone being bound to find a dead person, something else I found interesting was how they handled Snake being the one to find Claude. They did not make that up when Mr. Simpson told Eli that he found a student who'd committed suicide in his school days. Something simple as just having to use the bathroom led him to find Claude's body. And even though the effects didn't really seem to last too long, I really enjoyed the route that they took with Snake's character and his reaction to it. There was some anger there and shock. I especially love the line where he describes Claude's body as not looking like a person, and then being frustrated that, sure, someone had to find him. If it wasn't going to be Snake, it would have been someone else, but why him? Why did he have to be the one to do it? He didn't even know Claude, and yet he has such a huge effect on him. We don't know how long he was out of school for, but it affected him enough to where he felt that he couldn't go back to school for a while. I also feel that this situation, in combination with a lot of things in his life, helped lead him to the person, the teacher, the principal that he would later become, trying to empathize with people. And don't immediately go for the punishment, but step into someone else's shoes and try to see what you can do to help. Now, of course, he's not done the perfect job of this, but he does try. Death alone can be very confusing. Suicide more so. It has this strange effect of bringing people together. Those that didn't seem like they'd ever be able to work out any past issues. We can see that here with Wheels and Joey. Joey was rightfully mad at Wheels for stealing money from his mom and basically blaming everyone else for his problems with his grandparents and still dealing with his dead parents. But a lot of times after a death, there's a sort of pull that can bring two feuding sides back together. Joey was willing to listen to Wheels and try to reconcile their friendship that has lasted on and off since grade 8. One last thing I want to note is the discussion of whether or not to let the talent show go on. It was kind of partially linked to Claude because, as I said, Claude wanted to perform a monologue at the talent show, but Bronco and Lucy, the showrunners, wouldn't let him. And now, not just because they denied him, but because a student has died, there's the question of, should they allow the show to go on? A show that's going to be all about laughing and trying to forget about such things? It makes you think about the desire to pay respects to someone who's passed, but then also the fact that we're still here. They're gone, but we have to somehow keep living. Life can't just stop for us. What should be the period for mourning? There's really no rigid definition for how long a mourning period should be. Every culture has their own. Hell, every person has their own. It just so happened that people involved with the show decided that they wanted to allow it to go on. Sure, some students actually dropped out in protest, but they did at least try to recognize Claude's death while also letting themselves move on, i.e. by donating the profits from the talent show to an organization who would help people just like Claude, those who need help but don't know where to turn. Death, suicide in particular, is really hard to deal with. Even harder to explain and properly portray in media, but Degrassi did a wonderful job here. Anytime suicide is talked about with Degrassi, people always bring up Cam, partially because it's way more recent, partially because they also spent a lot more time with Cam before he died. But I think Claude's death should really be given a fair shake. It's well worth revisiting. And even though his death didn't quite have the lasting effects that Cam did, I mean, for one, this was the last season of Degrassi High, it's still a wonderfully done two-parter, and I feel just about as powerful as Cam's death. You can hear a lot of echoes of Claude's suicide in season 12 of Degrassi, but as always, they don't do it quite the same way. They play with ideas that they brought up previously and see what other angles they can twist them in. Thank you so much for consuming this video, and until next time.